Good morning, everybody, and a very warm welcome on behalf of Mace and the Northwest Construction Hub to our Meeting the Climate Emergency in the Built Environment webinar. My name is Caroline Lassen, Director of Government and Housing at Mace, and I'm delighted to see such a select group of our clients and partners in the virtual room this morning. I think we're all aware that addressing the climate change at pace is the challenge of our generation. 3/4 of local authorities in England have declared a climate emergency, but are at various different places in tackling it. With all organisations across the public sector being asked to do more with less, what is the solution? A significant part of the answer has to be exploring opportunities in retrofit, as none of us have a blank sheet of paper to start over with. The aim of today's session is to explore some of this and see what lessons learned and best practice we can learn from others, sharing experience across both public and private sectors. One thing we are sure of is that the key to achieving the end goal of decarbonisation is collaboration. So we're delighted to be able to speak with our partners at Manchester City Council and the Northwest Construction Hub, as well as the Cambridge Centre for Smart Infrastructure and Construction this morning, in support of Manchester's impressive drive to be a zero carbon city by 2038. So that leads me very nicely into introducing today's guest speakers. I'm delighted to welcome Jared Allen, Director of Capital Programmes at Manchester City Council, who's going to be talking to us today about the Council's net zero journey so far. Manchester City Council's Capital Programme Service delivers about £130 million of construction and maintenance projects every single year. That's over 400 individual schemes. They also manage construction and professional services frameworks for public sector clients across the North West. Jared is also the SRO for the impressive £330 million Our Town Hall project. And before joining Manchester City Council, he was a director at Turner & Townsend, and prior to that, Senior Executive Director of Estates and Facilities Management at the University of Chester. Jared's going to be followed by Dr. Jennifer Schooling, Director of the Cambridge Centre for Smart Infrastructure and Construction at the University of Cambridge. Jennifer's going to be talking to us about the Carbon Reduction Code for the built environment. I'm now going to shorten it, call it the CSIC. The CSIC is an innovation and knowledge centre with a specific aim to transform infrastructure and construction through smarter information. It brings together world-class engineering research, academic excellence and commercial industry to support the UK in becoming a world leader in the fields of sensing technology, asset management and smart city development. The centre focuses on how better data and information from a wide range of sensing systems can be used to improve our understanding of infrastructure, leading to better design, construction and management practices. Within the CSIC, Jennifer leads the Digital Cities for Change project. This project aims to deepen understanding of how built environment data can help improve city planning, management and the delivery of public services, demonstrating how built environment data and digital tools can be used to better inform more cohesive decision making. This has included a pilot project with Smart Cambridge to develop and assess a digital twin for strategic planning purposes. The CSIC last month launched the Carbon Reduction Code for the built environment, which we're really interested to hear more about today. After Jennifer, we have a short piece from Charmaine Hughes, Programme Manager and Head of Frameworks for Manchester City Council, talking about the Manchester pilot of the Carbon Reduction Code for the built environment. Charmaine serves as Chief of Staff to the Director and is a member of the senior management team responsible for overseeing complex, high-value programme of strategic construction projects. She's worked with Manchester City Council for over 13 years. She also oversees the Programme Management Office and the city's frameworks, with responsibility for providing construction contractor procurement and professional services frameworks to the council and other public bodies across the northwest of England. And last but not least, we have Dave Wakelin, Mace's Operations Director for Sustainability in our Responsible Business Practice, who's going to kick things off for us today, talking about the challenges and opportunities of the climate emergency. Dave has got almost 20 years of experience advising clients on a broad spectrum of sustainability topics, working across both the public and private sectors. Dave is a member of the RICS SCAR Steering Committee, which promotes sustainability best practice in the fit out and refurbishment sector, and has supported both the UK Green Building Council and the BRE on sustainable construction initiatives. Dave's got some really exciting projects on the go at the moment, not least working with the MOJ on reducing carbon in both their new build and existing estates. He was recently responsible for producing business cases for a number of MOJ properties, saving over 90,000 tonnes of carbon. So Dave, if it's okay by you, I will hand over to you to kick things off. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. Can you just jump on to the next slide, please, Paul? So yeah, thank you, Caroline, for the introduction. Just wanted to quickly state a little bit about sort of Mace's position on responsibility. We've wanted to be a responsible business for a number of years. It's been one of our key areas of focus. We recognise as a business we are a contractor, we're a consultant, we have a huge ability to go and influence the way we and our clients deliver projects around the country and around the world. And through that influence, we really want to make sure that we are really championing the cause of climate change. So through the redevelopment of our 2026 business plan, pursuing a sustainable world became one of our key priorities to make sure that we're really embedding our ambition, but also working alongside our clients to really push the agenda as we help you with your product going forwards as our clients. On to the next slide, please, Paul. So in terms of the climate emergency has never been higher on the agenda. The profile of climate change has ramped up massively over the last 3 or 4 years in particular. I mean, I've been working in the sector for 20. Never have I seen as much activity and political will to go and push the climate agenda harder and start dealing with the problems of climate change that have been kicking around for so many years and they've never really quite got the traction they need. See the 2018 Extinction Rebellion process, which I remember being sat in the town hall looking out the window 3 years ago, looking at the protests and then kids coming out from school. It's really started to sort of drive the agenda very, very hard. And because of that, the focus has never been higher. The impacts of it are obviously being felt by all of us. I think if you look at the recent Met Office data, I think April was the driest and coldest April we've had in the UK since records began. That's going to have impact on food production later in the year through fruit setting, for example. And then that's followed by the wettest May we've had since records began. At the same time, as listening to the news on Monday morning, we've got wildfires raging on the west coast of the US with unseasonably high temperatures causing massive disruption. So the impacts are being felt by populations around the world, and it stops just being a third world problem. For so many years, it was seen as being something that was really having an impact in that part of the world. That's not happening anymore. It's now impacting on all of us. So it's imperative on all of us to take some action because ultimately it's going to affect our quality of life as individuals, as societies, and as countries. COP26 is coming to the UK in November, so the priority for the UK government has never been higher. We are the shop window to the world into how we tackle climate change. The UK says leading, certainly back when the Climate Change Act was first introduced in 2008, we were the first country in the world to have set binding climate targets to become a net zero carbon country by 2050. And the pressure, if you look at different organisations, obviously the Manchester City Council are looking to accelerate their trajectory to 2038. We've got the Ministry of Justice looking to deliver to 2040. I think everyone's recognised the imperative to act quickly. We haven't acted quickly enough for a number of years, and we now need to really accelerate our response to make sure that we aren't going to be breaching the Paris Climate Accord and breaching the 1.5 degree C temperature rise that we think is going to be the trigger point for sort of unrecoverable climate change. So the emphasis is really there, the priority is really there. And then when you look at our sector, the diagram there sort of shows that the breakdown of global CO2 emissions, and the sector we're working with, its building operations, all the construction of new buildings, is responsible for about 40% of all global CO2 emissions. So we as a sector, and the buildings that we design, the buildings we operate, the buildings we occupy, have a massive part to play in terms of tackling that global climate challenge. Let's jump on to the next slide, please, Paul. The challenge really comes there with how we deal with our existing estate. It's suggested that about 80% of the building stock that will be around in 2050 is currently standing. There's been a lot of focus on new build projects achieving net zero carbon standards, which is great, and it's obviously a really strong priority to make sure that whatever we build now isn't going to cause a problem going into the future. But perhaps we haven't given quite as much focus as we could have done to the buildings that are in our current estate that are currently emitting carbon dioxide through their activities that we need to go and tackle. I did a bit of number crunching, and if we don't do anything to that existing building stock, because so much of that is going to be around in 30 years' time, we'll emit another 2.5 billion tonnes of carbon in the UK just from the properties that are currently standing, against the UK government target of being net zero by 2050, to still be emitting 80 million tonnes of carbon from an existing estate in 30 years' time is obviously not going to hit our objectives. So we really need to focus on how we manage and deliver carbon savings across our existing estate, given how big an impact it has on the UK's footprint, the global footprint, and within each of our organisations, our own operational footprint. So it's a big challenge. But there is a solution. You can just jump onto the next slide, please. This is an example that we've been delivering with one of our clients who is in the private sector. It's a global bank. We've been working with them since 2016, looking at trying to drive their carbon reduction performance across their global portfolio of buildings. They initially set a target of a 3% reduction in their carbon footprint by 2020 compared to their 2016 baseline. Which was, at the time, they thought was a stretch. They didn't think they'd get there. But actually, when you start to look at how you can deliver carbon savings through a variety of different means, we've managed to really accelerate their trajectory. In the end, we achieved about 30% carbon saving over that same period of time, which has really flipped the client's mindset in terms of how they want to go and tackle climate change as an organisation. They've gone from being very conservative and limiting their aspirations to recognising actually they can make some really great strides as an organisation. We can substantially reduce the carbon footprint of our estate. We can significantly improve the energy efficiency of our estate, and at the same time, that's actually starting to realise some real cost benefits in terms of utility cost savings. Where in this case we get $1 million a year investment budget. We've spent that over on a number of projects, whether it's capital works on existing buildings, all the way through to behavioural change programmes with occupants of buildings to try and get some competition going between different sites. Actually, so much of the energy and carbon we emit from buildings is because of inefficiencies and waste that is generated by us as the occupants. So by getting some of those programmes in place, you can really actually start just to make some fairly big changes without actually having to go and spend a huge amount of cash. And the net result of that is we've made a net saving of nearly $4 million just in utility costs, without the additional benefit of reputation that's come through from this organisation transforming itself and being seen differently by its peers. So it reports through the Carbon Disclosure Project, CDP, which is used very commonly in the private sector for benchmarking organisations' performance. They've gone from being a C-rated organisation to being an A-rated organisation. They're attracting investment from the bond markets, for example, that they're a bank. That really starts to help their position. So it's really demonstrated that as a client organisation, by being a little bit bold and looking at how you can deliver things differently, they've actually really started to accelerate their own response. And they're now setting zero carbon targets across their entire business by 2050, with some very steep acceleration up to 2030 to make those big savings very early in their decarbonisation plan, to make sure that they are minimising their footprints in the long term. Excuse me. Just jump on to the next slide, please, Paul. So, in terms of how can that be taken across from those clients into public sector, particularly talking to people on the call, I think there's really three strands to how that can be taken forward, decarbonisation can be taken forward. So I think first of all it's around data. We really need to understand the assets that you have. How are you maintaining them? What do they emit? How much energy do they use? How well occupied are those buildings? Once you start to understand that, you can really start to prioritise where you will make your investment to improve their performance, work out which assets you want to go and refurbish, which ones you dispose of, which ones you retain. So get that information in place up front, and that really starts to set the foundations for how you take a decarbonisation plan forward. Secondly is looking at funding. So there's been a large amount of public sector funding available over the last 18 months, partly through COVID response, partly through climate emergency response, whether it's through SALIX or anything else. So there's been some very successful bids coming through from a lot of public sector organisations to gather the funding to go and deliver long-term carbon reductions, whether it's through photovoltaic installations or increases in insulation on existing school estates, for example, some work that we've been doing. So the funding is there that can be used to drive efficiencies. But I think there's also opportunities within the budgets that we already have as organisations. All of us have PPM budgets. We want to go and spend money on planned maintenance. Actually, we think there's a real opportunity to actually go and use that money slightly differently and top up that funding with additional money, but not having to go and spend full capital projects on decarbonisation plans, which is a good example of what we're doing at the moment with the Ministry of Justice. To go and funded a full decarbonisation of one of the prisons we looked at would have cost £17 million. But actually, there's already PPM works in place that we can almost leverage the back of that saves about £11–12 million of that. So the net result is we can go and spend an extra £5 million and deliver nearly zero carbon prisons, which is a substantial improvement in terms of how your cost effectiveness stacks up. That's also backed up by things like spend to save initiatives. We start to recognise now that energy cost inflation is coming in, it's going to start to bite us. So there are some initiatives that we can look at in the short term that really start to make sure that we are spending capital now to actually save those inflationary costs up into the future. And one idea that actually we start to see a lot more of in the private sector is actually how we use internal carbon pricing. One of our construction clients currently effectively taxes their new build construction projects. So how much carbon they pay a tax back into the business, and that tax is effectively reinvested in refurbishment projects as a way of recycling money within the business to deliver carbon savings across their existing retained assets. So I think the funding is there, the funding is available, and then that links into how you go and deliver. All of us have big estates. There's the opportunity to go and rationalise that and actually work out which buildings we do keep within our portfolio, which ones we get rid of, which ones we look to do something differently with. That can have a big impact in terms of the organisational carbon footprint. There's also how would you deliver some of these decarbonisation plans through your existing facilities management and planned preventative maintenance programmes. Again, going back to the work we're doing with the Ministry of Justice, it's quite hard to go and work in their live estate. It's a prison in many cases, you can't turn it off. But we do have a planned maintenance programme that we can then piggyback onto to go and, when we're doing fire alarm replacements, for example, we can go and change the lighting in the same space and use that budget and use that time and that programme of works to sort of deliver multiple benefits all at once. Lastly, I mentioned the behavioural change piece that we worked on with our bank clients, getting some competition and some knowledge share between different parts of the organisation, different buildings, different assets, different departments can really start to help drive some of those efficiencies. Just through some internal healthy competition in many cases, which can really start to make some significant savings. We've been very focused on the technology answers for many, many years and haven't necessarily thought about the people we put into our buildings. So I think in summary, there's a suite of tools there and there's a suite of experience from other parts of industry, whether it's private sector or public sector, that give us a route to deliver significant savings in the retrofit and refurbishment sector. So just to quickly sum up, if you just jump onto my last slide, please, Paul. I think it's clear to see that the time to act is now. The political will has never been stronger. The pressure from the taxpayer and me as a member of civil society has never been higher. The money is there at the moment as well. That there is funding available through some of the funds that are being made pushed through from central government. There is funding there to make some of these things happen. The will is there. The technology is there, and I think there are plenty of examples coming through from different parts of the sector, whether it's public or private sector, to really start to drive the agenda very hard. So I think that was where I was going to close, and then sort of pass back to Caroline to take us into the next part of the presentation. Thank you. Thanks very much for
that, Dave. And I'm now just going to very briefly just break from the planned route we're going to take through this today. Sorry, Jared. I understand that we've got Karen Alford from the Environment Agency with us, and Karen, I understand you're leaving at 9 o'clock this morning. I wondered if you might just jump in before you go and just give us a bit of a heads up as to what the most significant actions that the Environment Agency are taking at the moment, sort of given the scene setting that Dave's done there. Sorry to put you on the spot, and you need to turn your mute button off as well, Karen.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I haven't got a presentation, but I will just very quickly sort of run through really our approach. And you know, as an organisation, we have been interested in our sort of carbon footprint for some time, so it isn't anything new for us. We have, I think, probably 10 or so years ago, we issued a sort of carbon calculator, which actually had worldwide take up. So, it's very welcomed across the world, and we've refined that. But as we move into, a new world, we recognise that we really do need to up our game and put carbon management at the centre. So we've been quite focused on, as they call it, the let's see if we can be making differences, as opposed to actually we will make a difference. And I think that is perhaps the turning point, moving from measurements to constructive action, and using the power that we have as a client body and an organisation that is interested in obviously the environment, looking at what we can do as an organisation, both within our projects and wider across the industry, to support the carbon, the net zero carbon approach. Now, I think I look after the data and information, so I'm going to be sort of probably coming at it from a data and information perspective. And I think, part of the challenge is giving people the right knowledge and insight to make the right decisions. So actually having information about sort of carbon values, having information about carbon values that is the same across every supplier, every entity. I think, that's quite key, because that doesn't exist at the moment necessarily everywhere. And looking at how we can use technology and use some of the innovations to not just in terms of product, but in terms of how we make our decisions. So one of the areas that we're working on now with a real strong focus is how can we ensure that the carbon decisions sit alongside the financial. So actually we're making our decisions on an equal basis, because there could be complexities when we actually come to looking at this, and particularly from an environment perspective. Our primary role is to protect against flooding, amongst other things, but that's really where our key focusing is. And if thinking about, do we build or not build, on paper that looks really good, but if your house is flooded, I think, well, actually you didn't build a hard concrete wall. Why? We know that we will be challenged and questioned. So we've got to ensure that we have a constructive, evidence-based way of making our decisions that puts carbon and that net zero into the heart of it. So I think like for many organisations, that's going to be the challenge. What we've also been doing is looking at how we can better understand how we are using our resources. So for instance, we've been developing maintenance standards. So we have maintenance activities, but actually the maintenance standards that help us understand the components that we can then start to target where the carbon costs are actually exist at the moment. So that we will gradually work through that, because I think that we have to be informed to make the right decisions, and in all cases we don't have that information to make the right decisions. And I think this is the challenge for us all, actually. And I think moving forward, it's how we can pull together and develop that understanding. And incidentally, this morning I had something around, for an example, lexicon, which Construction Innovation Hub have sort of looking at how we can automate things like product data, for an example. So understanding the carbon associated with the products we're using is obviously a really key part. So I think what we've got to recognise is there's lots of parts to the jigsaw. But actually the jigsaw is about having insight and knowledge and making the right decisions. So we are going to do our piece in helping people have the knowledge and have access to that information to make those right decisions.
That's great. I think that probably leads us nicely back into Jared. Thank you very much for that, and
that's okay.
your input there. Jared, you're going to be talking to us about the Manchester City Council journey thus far in getting to net zero carbon. I wonder if actually Karen's point there about whether we're measuring, in tenders, whether we're measuring carbon at the same, giving it the same credence as we are the commercials that come in. I wonder where you're at on that piece. I'm not sure if it's in your presentation, but perhaps we can come back on any questions if it's not.
As if by magic, Caroline, it is actually. So I will talk about procurement a little bit and how we try and influence that. And I think just to take kind of a couple of points that Dave and Karen have made in terms of these influencing factors. Part of the remit, as Caroline introduced, we do have a kind of a direct delivery function within the service. We also manage the City Council's overall capital budget, which is about 1.4 billion over the next 4 to 5 years. And fortuitously or not, we are now, or I'm now responsible for our estate, our corporate estate and FM functions. So we've kind of got an overview and an influence across quite a breadth of the work that the City Council do, which is good. And then we can take some of those factors, particularly some of the elements that Karen talked about education. How do we measure? How do we bring others along the journey? And we are slightly different within local authorities and city councils. We're not a private organisation with kind of simpler forms of decision making, shall we say. It is a much more complex beast, not least the political angle, but also making sure that we are responding to our residents' needs, because ultimately that's what we're there for. So just to give you kind of a bit of an overview of where we've got to so far, I think, as you mentioned before, we have declared a climate emergency that was declared in July 2019. It was signed off by the council in March 2020, and I think we all remember March 2020 as being quite a significant month in the year. That was a very detailed piece of work that we did. Why did we do it? As I said before, we're here for our residents and our businesses, and we need to do more as a council, as a city, in order to achieve that very difficult, I think, target of achieving the net zero by 2020. We had made a significant inroad into our direct emissions. In the 10 years previous to that, we achieved about 54% reduction in our direct emissions, which was pretty good going. But the zero carbon by 2038 is difficult. It's a 13% year-on-year reduction. And as we all know, if you don't hit the 30% in 1 year, it just rolls over the next year and makes it more difficult to achieve. So it is something that we are very focused on. How are we going to do that? How we've introduced it? The council has endorsed the plan in 2020, and we split that into a very detailed action plan. And the action plan is 5 areas overseen by a strategic group. The strategic group is chaired by our deputy chief executive and city treasurer, which is good because she's got the big checkbook. And those 5 areas were very well defined and very well engaged. They were buildings and energy, transport and travel, consumption, storage, and then, as Karen was alluding to before, behaviour. And there was a working parties across the organisation filtering up into that strategic group. And we do think that in order to achieve some of the activities and the actions within that, then we had to make some changes. And we started on the journey. We've made further changes since then. So procurement, and I'll come on a little bit more about procurement on our procurement strategies and how we influence our suppliers and the people that we touch through our investments and the work that we do across the city. Our capital gateway, we changed the capital gateway in terms of having environmental impact assessments within that kind of business case sign off. We also have every single committee and executive report that goes to our council has an EIA statement in there to drag that back to our action plan to make sure that all the work that we're doing right across the board, not just in capital, has an effect on the environmental impact that the city council does. And I thought, anyone who's working in Manchester, living in Manchester, or knows what Manchester are doing, and that the Manchester the Our Manchester strategy. It is embedded absolutely right the way through the Our Manchester strategy. So I think in terms of policy-wide, I think we've made quite a lot of inroads in terms of some of the kind of nuts and bolts activities. I think the policy agenda, probably something we'll come on to a little bit more in the webinar, and you know, how we can then influence further and what policy decisions we can make that will then you know, kind of reach out to our private sector, to our developers, to our other people within the city. So that's really good. But just to give you some, I think it's worth, and Dave talked about some of the examples that he's working on with his client base. From the council's point of view, I mean, the Department for Business, Energy, Industrial Strategy announced this £1.1 billion funding available for local authorities for the decarbonisation of the estate. GMCA identified about 150 projects and was successful in leveraging about £78 million worth of investment. 21 of that came to Manchester City Council. So it's quite a significant element. On top of that, we also invested around about 90 million in decarbonisation elements, not low-hanging fruits, but some of the easier ones that we can achieve around our leisure estate, looking at things like LED lighting, smart controls, BMS systems, and all those kind of good things that we can influence directly into our estate that we currently manage, and that has a direct impact on the residents. They might not see it, but it does. And I think one of the things I wanted to add in, just in terms of this, I think one of the key elements is actually between March 2020 and where we're at the moment, we've seen a significant reduction in our direct carbon impacts because we've been working from home. We haven't been travelling. People haven't been travelling to work. They haven't been travelling anywhere else. And I think we've got to wrestle that in terms of, well, what does that mean to other priorities that the city has got in terms of businesses, about the economy, about getting, you know, that kind of really vibrant city activity back in? And that's a lot of the conversations we're having around, wouldn't it be great if people carried on working from home and being on these Teams meetings? God forbid. But, you know, what if we do that? That does have a direct impact on what we're talking about now in terms of the carbon. But, you know, we've done other big major projects as well. The Civic Quarter Heat Network, for those who are involved in that, it's quite an impactful piece of infrastructure. That was 24 million. We've changed all our street lights into LEDs. That was another 40 million. So it gives you some really good examples of some of the things that we have been doing proactively. But I'll speed up. Don't worry, Caroline, I will speed up. In terms of kind of the strategic perspective, I think we can't ignore some of the impacts that COVID has had, particularly on funding for local authorities. I think the last piece I read was something like a £9 billion shortfall in local authority funding. That does have a significant effect on what we can invest in our capital construction, our projects. We stalled some of our major projects last year in order to protect the city's position, about £100 million worth of projects, which is just delayed. Now, some of those projects, particularly around the leisure estate, our sporting legacy estate from the Commonwealth Games, that they had carbon reduction measures built in. So we've delayed those elements. It will come back, but we've had to support our businesses, we've had to support our residents, and we've had, that will have a significant impact on things going forward, not least the 320 million we're spending on the town hall, which has to be paid for from somewhere. But notwithstanding that, it is a key focus. It is a key strategy for the city, is the environment, carbon reduction. To just touch on and come back into that procurement element of it, I think people were aware we have a 20% weighting for social value across all our commissioning. We now have an additional 10% for carbon. Okay. So we are being very proactive in the £5 billion worth of activities that the council kind of are involved with. Right. Actually, what we're saying of all our commissioning is a 10% weighting. So we can directly influence, we can be the leaders, we can be kind of the trailblazers, not just for Manchester, but looking at what we do in some of those activities. I'm not saying it's perfect. I know I'm being recorded, but it's not perfect, and there's a long way to go. And I think we can do more than we are doing at the moment. I think funding is and Dave touched on this, funding is going to be a key element. Collaboration, partnerships, dealing with the private sector, getting the private sector on board to look at the wider good. that will all be absolutely key. So all Dave's points are very, very valid for local authorities, because we can't afford to do it all ourselves, and we haven't got the capacity to do it all ourselves either. But in kind of, we've declared our action plan. We've done large scale projects. We've looked at another circa 300 million of projects that we can influence. We haven't got that 300 million, but again, we need to look at how we can fund those going forward. We have done some of the big stuff. We've done, the cycling and walking, infrastructure projects, green homes grants. I won't go on about it because it's well documented. But I think funding sources, and not just grants, I think they're the key things. Innovative solutions, shared goals, shared activities, shared projects. I think they're the key things to further overcome some of the challenges. And I'll pause there.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jared. And I think, innovative projects and innovative solutions does actually lead us really nicely into Dr. Jennifer Schooling from the CSIC, who's going to talk to us about the new carbon reduction code for the built environment. I think that's a nice leaping off point. So thank you, Jared, and over to you, Jennifer.
Thanks, Caroline. Next slide, please, Paul. So as Caroline said, I'm going to be talking about the carbon reduction code for the built environment. So it is very much focused on the, if you like, the physical asset base. Jared was very rightly pointing out that is then in tension with a whole load of other things that cities and communities have to grapple with. The built environment doesn't exist in isolation, so I'm very conscious of that. Nonetheless, I think most people on this call have responsibility for the sort of physical built environment and how we reduce the carbon impact of that. So that's where my focus is going to be. Next, please, Paul. So just to sort of recap and go back a little bit to what Dave was saying, why carbon emissions matter. Now, we all know a lot of this, I know. The UK government put the target of net zero by 2050 into law in 2019, and just this year have gone for, I think, is it 75% by 2038, which is really encouraging. I think that there are a number of challenges still, however. The first is that it's great to have the target, but we've actually got to deliver on it. And the other thing is that a linear reduction from 2019 to 2050 will not be fast enough to avoid 1.5 degrees centigrade of warming. Our current emissions are exceeding our carbon budget massively, and at the rate we're going, our carbon budget will be finished if we want to reach 1.5 degrees C of warming by about 2028, 2030, possibly sooner. The other thing is that every tonne of carbon dioxide that we put up into the atmosphere today stays there for 100 to 200 years and carries on heating the atmosphere for that 100 to 200 years. So it's absolutely critical that we save as much carbon as we can as early as we can. And we have to do that, therefore, with existing technologies and solutions and, behaviour change, etc., that we can actually get our hands on now. Not to say we shouldn't continue as a society to be investing in innovation, absolutely we must, but we can't wait for that innovation to come along. We have to do everything that we can now. And I think the key thing I want to say is, we're all very conscious about what we do in our private lives, reducing plastic, getting our homes insulated, etc. But everybody on this call, we have the potential through our professional lives, as was beautifully highlighted by Jared and Karen and Dave earlier, to actually make a difference through our roles in our jobs as well. So, we really need to try and take responsibility for that. Next slide, please, Paul. So in terms of our built environment, I'm aware that a lot of the people on this call are also involved with retrofit. So if wherever I say build, you can think about retrofit and maintenance as well. Build is shorthand for any physical intervention that we make. We need to decide what we need to build, how we should build it, and with which materials and processes. So the first question is, if we're looking at building something new, do we need to, or is there another solution? Can we rehabilitate something we already have? Because we've already invested carbon and materials into every bit of our built environment that we have around us. And as I think it was Dave said earlier, 80% of what we'll have in 2050 is here right now. So 80% of our 2050 problem is with us now. If we do have to build or make an intervention, do we need to do as much of it? And if we do need, with what we do need to build and create, what should we build with? So what are the lowest embodied carbon materials that we can use? And can we optimize the design and reduce the waste in the sort of construction or maintenance processes as we go along? And then also, can we think about, if we're, for example, investing in thermal massing by pouring a lot of concrete now, what's the life cycle of that building or asset going to be into the future? Because if we're assuming a 100-year life and actually we take it down after 40, then we've misinvested that carbon. And remember, every tonne of carbon we emit today is up there for the next 200 years heating the planet. So we really need to think about everything in our designs. And I know Jared said that unfortunately a number of your projects have been sort of postponed and delayed, but I think we need to look at every opportunity that we can to do better, and perhaps a delay in a project is an opportunity to stand back and think, actually, what more could we do to reduce the carbon here? And often carbon reductions actually come with cost reductions. So a little bit more time invested at the beginning of a project can often help to not just reduce carbon, but also reduce cost. But it needs to be at the forefront of our thinking all the time. Next slide, please, Paul. The other thing I'm going to allude to, and Karen sort of touched on this when she was talking, is the importance of measuring and real data. Lord Kelvin back in 1883 said, if you don't measure it, you can't improve it. And I think particularly in the sort of the built environment world, construction, infrastructure, buildings, we are not yet terribly good at really measuring what we do. So we need to learn from the real performance of our buildings. We need to calculate and optimise carbon in the design, as I've just said. We need to calibrate our design models against real performance. With buildings, if we've designed a low carbon building, we need to go back and really learn, in use, is it really low carbon? We need to control processes on construction sites and when we're doing retrofit and maintenance in order to have a better handle on how much material we're using to really reduce the amount of waste we have. We need to use standards like PAS 2080 to help us do that well and do it in a way that is consistent. We need to monitor and manage waste, assess and declare our actual embodied carbon, because if we don't do that, we don't know where we are with respect to our carbon budget. And then we need to measure, monitor and reduce carbon fuel use, invest in innovation and measure again. So every time we think we've made an improvement, we need to go back and check we have, not just assume that all's going to be well. Next slide, please, Paul. So all of this brings me to the Carbon Reduction Code for the Built Environment, which we launched a couple of weeks ago, along with the Construction Leadership Council's Construct Zero initiative. And I think the first thing to say is that this is a first step to facilitate action by all the relevant parties towards reducing carbon emissions in the sort of, if you like, the capital investment, the construction, maintenance and operation of our built environment assets. It is absolutely not intended to replace existing standards like PAS 2080. In fact, it references them. But it's a framework for organisations to make a public commitment and report on progress towards net zero. And I think this is the really crucial thing. If we don't have data, we can't know how fast we're getting there. And if we're not getting there fast enough, we need to know that. And we need to work together to figure out how to do better, because this is all our futures that are going to be impacted. We're very good at thinking about health and safety in our industry. This is a health and safety issue. It's just a health and safety issue whose impacts happen a few years down the line rather than tomorrow when someone falls through a poorly installed barrier, for example. So we absolutely need to take it as seriously as that. The other important thing is it does align with things like the recently issued UK government procurement policy note that's nattily titled PPN 0621. But if you Google that, you will find it's all about carbon reduction in procurement. And that really does start to push carbon reduction into a much higher level of focus. So the code has three key parts. One is a couple of core commitments for all organisations. Then there are commitments for client organisations and commitments for supply chain organisations. I'm not going to talk through all of it because there's a fair amount of text, but I will put a link in the chat later to the code itself so that you can go and look at it in detail. But if you could take me to the next slide, please, Paul. So the core commitments for all organisations are that we will aim to reduce our direct and indirect carbon emissions by 75% by 2030 in order to meet zero carbon by 2045. Now, there's a couple of big numbers in there. So 2045 we used because this is intended to be a UK document, and the Scottish Government, liking to be ahead of everyone else, have said they want to reach net zero by 2045. As I said earlier, we probably need to get there sooner. And we've gone for 75% by 2030, which again is ahead of the UK government target, because actually that's what we need to do if we want to get to 1.5 to remain below 1.5 degrees. Now, we've said we will aim to reduce because we know this is a hard ask, but I think if we don't aim for a stretch target, we won't get there. You know, history is littered with people aiming for something and not quite making it. So let's aim for something that we think is a stretch target. If we get there, that's fantastic. But if we're missing it, we're missing a stronger target. So I think we really do need to think about these things. The key commitment then is to set out plans to meet net zero by 2045, including annual targets and recognising that the majority of these cuts will need to be made by 2030. and crucially to publish the plans and progress against it annually. So that's the sort of the chunky thing that we're trying to achieve. Next slide, please, Paul. If you look at the code, you'll see then that we've got client commitments and supply chain commitments, and they're divided into core commitments and further commitments. So if an organisation wants to sign up to the code, they have to deliver against the core commitments, and they are sort of more measurable things. The further commitments are about the sort of collaboration to deliver greater progress against the needs. And I'm just going to briefly talk through the core client commitments now. So if you could go on, Paul, to the next slide. So clients' commitments are to include carbon reduction targets and reporting commitments explicitly in all procurement documents. So for any project, be it a construction project or a maintenance project, the key thing is that procurement will require carbon reduction. And again, this kind of fits nicely with the PPN 0621 note that I mentioned earlier, and that will use PAS 2080 or equivalent standards as the reference document for achieving this. PAS 2080 goes into quite a lot of good detail. It's currently being revised, but the previous version of it is a very good document, so I recommend reading it if you haven't had a chance to look at it. Second commitment is to providing a carbon baseline for each project and setting targets for carbon reduction against these baselines. Now, this particularly applies obviously to longer term projects. If you've got a 6-month programme, it's kind of difficult to do that, but perhaps you can set a carbon reduction target against the previous project in that case, or where you have sort of rolling programmes of maintenance, for example. And then finally, committing to having carbon data externally verified as part of reporting requirements. The further client commitments then are really largely around working with the supply chain and supporting the supply chain. And then the supply chain commitments, which at the moment are a little bit more focused on if you like, the kind of the bigger organisations like Mace, are again about supporting the clients in this ambition, delivering ourselves, and then helping the lower tiers and the smaller organisations in the supply chain to come along with this. And I think we have to recognise that an awful lot of companies in the construction and RMI sectors are small businesses who don't have lots of spare capacity to be addressing this kind of stuff. So as larger organisations, we really need to be helping them go on that journey as well. Next slide, please, Paul. So what next? I will shortly put a link in the chat to the code. So if you could please read the code. If you're keen to work with us on this, then either pledge to comply, which you can do by sending an email, or submit a compliance form. Caveat that we're still setting up the compliance form, so at the moment you need to express an interest in it, and we'll contact you as soon as the form is online. But basically, if you can see the commitments, you can start working out how you comply with them. We will be listing organisations who are pledging or complying on the website. We're going to have a formal launch. So what we've issued is version 1 of the code. The intention is to update it fairly regularly. So I anticipate that it would be good if we can update it before we do the formal launch at COP26. So what we're really keen is for some organisations to have a go at complying with it. Let us know what the problems are. Let us know if you think there are any edits needed to the code, and then we'll consider all of that. And the intention is to try and up-issue it before COP26, but certainly we think it should probably be reviewed annually because the world is changing very fast, as previous speakers have said. Next slide, please, Paul. And just one last thing, I want to acknowledge the many people from across industry who had input to the development of the code, everybody on here, and in particular, Kat Ibbotson from the Environment Agency, Chris Hayes from Skanska, who did a pilot on the HS2 project, and Charmaine Hughes, who worked with the NACF and in her role at Manchester to do a pilot on how we might you might take that forward in the sort of city council context. So I think Charmaine's talking next, but I'll hand back to Caroline now. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's lovely. Over. Thank you very much for that, Jennifer. And over to Charmaine to briefly just touch on the pilot that the Manchester City Council have done of the code and how that's going before we wrap up with some questions.
Thank you, and thank you, Jennifer. It's very kind of you. So, as was mentioned before, I've got a dual role within the council, a programme manager for Jared, and also head of frameworks for the North West Construction Hub. I've also acted previously as a client for the council in managing Manchester's public realm assets for several years. So that gives me 3 lenses on the carbon reduction agenda, all client focused. So I'd just like to share a little bit of information quickly about where we've been, what we've been doing the last few months in supporting Manchester to achieve its net zero 2038 ambitions. So our capital programme is extensive: schools, leisure centres, housing, both new build and refurbishment projects. As Jennifer said, to make a difference, we need to look at our future construction pipeline with a different lens, think about what we're building. Question, do we actually need to build at all? Problem is, many of our projects are developed in response to a statutory requirement, so not building isn't always an option. Therefore, we've got to build more sustainably. We know that effective early planning to ensure our future buildings are as sustainable as possible, given very tight budget envelopes, can make the biggest impact on our future carbon emissions. When delivering a typical school or medium-scale residential building, around 67% of the carbon emissions come from the operation of the building, around 21% from the manufactured materials to construct the building, about 1% through transportation, and only 1% from the actual construction process itself. 1%, that's a very interesting figure. So as clients, we really need to think about how we can do things differently. There are many challenges to consider. Many of our building projects are grant funded, usually to a tight budget, whether it's DFE funding. Carbon mitigation is not always cheap. Therefore, to build more sustainably, public bodies need to think about how they fund that. Do they need to borrow additional funds or reallocate budget from another source? Manchester's government structures are very solid now, hey Jared. We've got great systems in place to approve our capital spend. We're constantly improving those systems to help us to understand and measure the carbon impact of each project, from feasibility all the way to project completion and evaluation, so we can understand whether we've delivered on our carbon commitments. We've developed a new Manchester low carbon build standard, shout out to Barney Hall, who's on this call, and that was endorsed by the Manchester Climate Change Agency. It applies to all new build and refurb projects, and it's based on the Sustainable Outcomes Guide 2019 Operational Energy. Recommends that all projects should target a stretch goal of the next REBA milestone. So, for example, in 2025, we designed for 2030. It's got a top 10 list of priorities that we need to incorporate into all projects: solar PV, energy efficient heating, etc. We've got to take it a step further, though, as we've all said today, and we've got to understand the carbon impact of our contracted partners and our construction sites, not just what we're doing as public bodies. So public sector not-for-profit frameworks such as the North West Construction Hub, we've got a unique USP compared with private sector frameworks. We understand, excuse me, that's my 4-year-old laughing, we understand the drivers and challenges faced by public bodies: carbon, lack of funding, political challenges. We experience them ourselves. We're delighted to have had the opportunity to work with Jennifer and the National Association of Construction Framework colleagues on the launch of the code. As an NACF group, we've collaborated to develop a KPI and scoring metrics to support the delivery of the code. This will help the North West Construction Hub to understand and capture and measure the impact of our contractors' absolute emissions. We've worked with our contractor groups and board members to review and test the KPIs, ensuring that they're applicable to all sizes of contractors, and all of them are supportive. We've developed a call to action for our contractors, asking them to sign up to the code and to provide a range of information, which we will then baseline, measure and evaluate annually. We'll also be asking larger contractors to mentor smaller ones, and we'll be monitoring and sharing details of innovative approaches. This will provide additional data to internal MCC and external North West Construction clients, enabling them to see the achievements of their contractors in supporting their net zero ambitions. Finally, we need to think about the FM approach. 67% of carbon emissions emitted during the operation of the building. So we need to think about that. More sustainable design will offset this, but the most sustainably designed building won't function in the way it's intended if it's not used in the manner in which it should be. So we need to think about our FM approach in the future. We're also looking, as a capital programmes department, working with our internal capital finance colleagues to review and improve our internal processes and develop an education programme. I think very early we were saying today how important that role of education is. We're also working on a trial with the Construction Innovation Hub on their value toolkit that will again help us to achieve best value in delivering our capital construction programme, and to help deliver ensure that we are able to fully understand and measure our carbon benefits. I hope you found that interesting. Thank you very much for your time, and I'll hand back to Caroline.
Thanks for that, Charmaine. And I'm a bit conscious of time, but thank you very much to all our speakers. You've given us lots of food for thought. I was going to be opening it up to questions, but what I might just suggest is if anyone on the call wants to unmute themselves and just share their own experiences, either as a client or a consultant in this space. If anyone wants to do that, it'd be great to hear your reactions to some of what's been said. And whilst I wait for people to either pop their hands up, or we've had a few questions I think in the chat which have mostly been answered. I might just, oh, we have got a hand. Jenny, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I thought I'd share a bit of experience that I guess will be common to many, which is that there are people who get it and there are others who are struggling to do the right thing, and at some point between proposing good things and getting them actually implemented, there's always a blocker. Yeah. And I do find it really strange that I've been getting lots of feedback from my engineers that they propose doing something that they think will either make it more comfortable in hot weather in our stations, or more resilient to climate damage, or will reduce carbon. But when we use this with third-party funders, we always get told we're gold plating. I was like, well, who's your third-party funding? Well, it's a local authority who have signed up to a climate emergency declaration, just like we have, you know. How have we not got ourselves aligned to the point that we're actually delivering what we say we're going to? So hopefully this carbon reduction code is something that's going to really help us to demonstrate that we're all pulling in the same direction. And yes, carbon is actually important enough to spend a bit of money on if that's the right thing to do.
And it doesn't actually always need to cost more, does it? I think gold plating is a slightly outdated view as well, isn't it? I don't know, Jared and Charmaine, have you got any comment on that, or Dave, if you want to come in as well about sort of bringing people together?
I mean, just quickly, Caroline. Yeah, I mean, I think historically, we've come from a point where a lot of these interventions, shall we say, have been VE'd out by authorities. I mean, when I've came into the sector, you could see, well, we've got a budget, and the budget might have been set historically by someone who hasn't got a clue how to set the budgets, and then you get to a point where actually this is the cost of whatever that project is, and they want to kind of take things out, so they'll take things out like you know, carbon measures, whatever they are. So I think historically it's been the case. I think from the local authorities now, particularly Manchester, we've introduced carbon literacy training, so more people can understand. Training's the key. Getting politicians on board and getting decision makers on board to understand what we're doing and why we're doing it. I think absolutely Jenny is key. But I think a lot of it is history, and hopefully we'll coming out of that cloud, shall we say. Yeah,
great. Now listen, it's 9:29, so I'm going to have to wrap things up. I think we've got a bit of a lesson learned here. It's too big a topic to try and cover in an hour, but thank you to all our speakers. It's been fascinating what you've got to say, and Jennifer, I'm sure there's going to be a number of people hitting that link to the code and hopefully dropping you an email of support and saying they're going to be signing up. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Hopefully you found it useful. We will be issuing a link to the presentation within the next couple of days, and I think you'll also be getting a feedback form, so hopefully you don't mind spending a couple of minutes just giving us a bit of feedback and telling us that we need to spend an hour and a half on our next session. So everyone have a great day. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you all soon.